Hi, I'm Lisa. Welcome to the Vintage Kitchen. I'm so delighted to bring to you another recipe from the past today. Today, we're actually making medieval gingerbread. This recipe is from England from the 1400s. And you might wonder, well, what's the difference between medieval gingerbread and the gingerbread we make into cookies or cakes today? Well, we're going to talk about the origin today of how gingerbread evolved into what it started out as and what we know as that yummy treat today. It's actually very, very interesting. So let's start from the very beginning. So ginger is, of course, one of the first ingredients we think of that goes into gingerbread. Well, if you don't already know, ginger is actually comes from the root of a plant. Ginger came from Southeast Asia, and people have been cultivating ginger for the last about 7,000 years or so. So it's something that's quite common for many cultures to use. Now, we think that ginger spread from Asia through the Silk Road into what is now Europe in the Middle East. And it was a very popular traded item. And it was valued for, of course, its medicinal purposes. And a lot of medieval cookery certainly has that aspect of cooking also for medicine as well as for filling your belly. So ginger was a common plant to use as time went on. But it wasn't being grown in Europe at the time. So we have ginger, which is a common element. Another element that's also another spice from Asia is white pepper. So we have pepper today of ground white peppercorns. Also a very popular medieval spice, again probably traded along the Silk Road as well. And then one of our other ingredients we're using today is actually cinnamon. And we have some cinnamon sticks again. This is coming from Southeast Asia as well. And it's the bark of a tree from around the Indonesian area. And today we're going to be using some ground cinnamon. And that is also quite popular in medieval cookery as well, all of those spices. So that gives you a little bit of background on the spices that we're using today. Now, gingerbread, before we get too excited, I do have to say, if you're expecting this to be a cake or a cookie, you're going to be disappointed. So if you need to remove the idea of the word of gingerbread from your mouth, from your head, and your mouth and taste buds as far as what they're expecting, think candy, think confection instead. So that is definitely an option. So we're going to go ahead and get started, and I'll tell you a little bit about things as we go along. So what I have done today for you is I have poured a cup of honey onto my pot here. I'm going to slide it over a little bit so you can see. Now, you might be wondering about, why am I using honey and not something else? Well, honey was the most common sweetener in the Middle Ages. Sugar was not really being grown very much at all, and so before you had the sugar canes being grown and the option for molasses in the 1600s, most folks making gingerbread are going to be making the gingerbread they're making is with honey. And in fact, some European bakeries today making forms of gingerbread still actually use honey instead of some other kind of sweetener like molasses or treacle. So we put this honey on to boil, and I don't know if you can see here, but the idea is for it to come to a boil. Now, the directions actually say to skim the bubbles, the foam off the top. And I think that kind of depends on your honey that you're using. In the Middle Ages, it's more raw and unprocessed honey. And I'll move this better where you can see it. So you see it's come to a nice boil. So I'm just going to skim off the bubbles here. I think that's mainly if there's any impurities. If you're using raw and unfiltered honey, you want to get that off and kind of skim it off. But I don't know that this is really a necessary step. But certainly the directions from the original recipe talk about that. And then what it asks you to do is to turn down to almost very, very low. And we're going to add in our spices at this point in time. So make sure you can see this here. So what spices do we have for you today? Well, the original recipe actually, and we'll show that in a little bit, it didn't actually call for ginger. That is what is so incredibly surprising about this recipe. And in fact, I know people who have made it and didn't put the ginger in, and they say it tastes perfectly fine without the ginger. But what I do have for you today is a teaspoon of ginger, and this is optional, and you can adjust to taste if you like ginger more. I've got 1/8 of a teaspoon of white pepper, but again, if you like more pepper flavor, you can adjust it up as needed. So I'm putting that together as far as my spices go. And then I've also got a teaspoon of ground cinnamon I'm putting in here as well. And we're just going to go ahead and add the spices to our honey. It's on low heat now, and get that all mixed in. Our next step that we're going to be working on is going to be adding the breadcrumbs. And at this point, if you want to kind of take it off the heat, let it calm down a little bit, you can. So I think the spices are nicely mixed in here. I'm not seeing any lumps in here. And I'm going to slowly add in breadcrumbs. Now, were you surprised when I said breadcrumbs? There's no flour in this. There are no eggs. And so the early gingerbread recipes just used breadcrumbs. This was a great way to use leftover table scraps. And in fact, there's talk that even the Christian monks throughout Europe, because they also tended to keep beehives around, also added the breadcrumbs in with the honey. Now, this concept of honey cakes has actually been around much older than the Middle Ages. We know that the ancient Romans and the ancient Egyptians and the ancient Greeks were making a form of a honey cake, which they used. So this concept isn't completely new. So I've slowly started stirring in the honey here with the spices, and then added these breadcrumbs. So you might be wondering, well, when did flour get added? Well, around about the 1500s into the 1600s, you start seeing more recipes using flour and adding eggs. But we're just going to keep stirring this. It's going to form a nice stiff dough. And once it's kind of all mixed together, you'll still see a few little breadcrumbs here and there. We're going to take it completely off the heat, and we're just going to set it aside and let it cool for a moment. So while we're doing that, letting it cool, clear off some space here at our table. We need a little bit of space here. So once it cools, we have some room to work. So we'll get this off the table as well and set this aside. So I'm going to let that cool for a moment while I tell you a little bit more and fill you in on some background. So we've talked about adding flour and how eggs came about into that. And so by the 1700s, you start seeing gingerbread cakes and cookies. So how were they even developing this into a gingerbread? Well, you'll see from today's recipe, we're simply going to roll it out and cut it into squares, although I will show you some examples of some other modern adaptations you can do. But the original recipe from the 1400s did mention just rolling it out flat and cutting it into squares. But during about that same time, by the late 1400s, you actually see them starting to push them into wooden carved, elaborately carved molds. And as time went on, these molds got more and more fancy with their carvings and the different designs. They added new and more ones as time went on. and they started adding decorations of colored sugars by the 1700s as well. So certainly these elaborately pressed molds, and you saw a picture in our very beginning title slide of what these would look like. These were still very common to be used basically in the 1500s, 1600s, and 1700s, and through maybe the early 1800s. But then that form of molding the gingerbread kind of fell by the wayside. So you certainly have that evolution. And gingerbread was eaten at this time year round, and it became a popular treat. Now, initially, it was just for the wealthy because of the cost of the spices, but as the spices became more and more available, of course, the price went down, and they were certainly able to make them. And so you had even gingerbread guilds forming by the 1400s, and these were closely guarded recipe secrets of how they made their gingerbread. And they had entire fairs dedicated to gingerbread as well. So it was very popular. Certainly they thought it was healthy for digestion in the stomach, and they also thought that gingerbread could help aid in some romance as well. So there were multiple reasons why gingerbread became so popular amongst the crowds. And you might also be wondering, where did gingerbread, the origin of its name, come from? Well, gingerbread comes from, we think, a French word called gingerbread. And so we think that it kind of evolved from that. But let's go ahead. I think our gingerbread is cool enough now that we can go ahead and put this down. Now, at this point, here's the trick. You want to have it cool enough that you can handle without burning your fingers. So I'm putting my clean fingers in here, and I can certainly touch it, and it's not going to burn me, especially on top. So you can start working with that first, especially if you're going to push it into molds. Now, I don't have historical molds to use, but here's the cool thing about this recipe. I have gone out and purchased some silicone molds here to experiment with, and what I found is you don't want these huge molds. Try to get something that's small. So this is a little snowflake pattern here that I got. And then you also have something like holly, berries, and leaves. These came out okay too. I think the concept is when you push these down, you have to push down quite firmly. So I'll give you an example of a few that I'll do for you here. And you can even, once you push it down initially, if it's still a little too warm for your fingers, get it going, get it started. You can let it sit just a little bit longer, because as I'm delving in, I can feel down below the dough is still quite warm. And I can go back and do a little bit more firm packing, because you really want to, if you want to get this impression design, it's got this lovely little snowflake pattern, you need to push it down a little bit firmer into the mold here. So I'll show you how that's going to look. Hopefully by the end of our program I'll be able to pop that out for you. It'll be cool enough. I found the holly and berries didn't work quite as well. I almost got a Christmas tree or a Santa, but honestly those molds were so large. This is a fairly spicy treat, so you want to basically be able to eat it within a bite or two. You don't want to make it this very large, more than a couple bite-sized treats, because it is a bit challenging here to work with if you make it too small or too big. So I'll just do a couple more to show you, and like I said, hopefully by the end we can pop these out to show you. And I do have, you saw at the beginning, I do have a finished products from what I worked with yesterday. This is a great little treat to also do with kids, because it comes together so quick and simple. They can help add the spices and stir. Just be careful with them around the boiling honey. And once it cools enough, they can roll it into balls. Now, one other option that the original recipe talks about is you can actually not add all the cinnamon in with the spices when you're stirring it into the honey once it's boiled. You can keep maybe half out, and once it's rolled out, you can dust it with cinnamon at the end. So that's a couple options. So I've got these in my molds. I'm going to set them aside, um, for you to see as they cool. And I'm going to dump the rest of my dough out onto my parchment paper here. Again, it's very thick, stiff dough. It's still quite warm, firm to the touch, and that's where, you know, a good sturdy spoon will help you get it all out. And really, once this all kind of comes together into a nice stiff dough ball, you're not really touching it a whole lot, because we're going to get this, and we're going to get our rolling pin going as well. So we're just going to form it into a little bit better ball. It is quite sticky, so certainly keep that in mind as you're working with this, because it is honey. It's not the same stickiness as like a cookie dough is, but you certainly have that there. So we're going to leave that, and I'm going to grab my rolling pin here. And we are just going to give it a roll out. Now, it's completely up to you how thick you want to roll out your dough here. Just keep in mind that when you do go to cut it, if you can try to make it into a more square or rectangular shape, that is helpful. So I'm going to just kind of pat it here a little bit on the sides, and this will help me see where I might need to roll it out more. It's still quite warm, so it's going to take some time to roll out. And if you're wondering where gingerbread men came into play, well, there's a theory about that. Supposedly this was at the court of English Queen Elizabeth I for a Christmas festival. She wanted something to entertain her courtiers, and she had her own gingerbread baker dedicated to the royal household, and they created gingerbread men resembling the men and women of her court. So that's kind of a neat idea. Now, how true this is, I'm not so sure, but that supposedly was the origin. So we're talking, you know, late 1500s into early 1600. So that's possible origins of gingerbread men. And then a lot of people often ask about gingerbread houses. We don't know the exact origin of when gingerbread houses started, but they were probably around in Germany from about the 1600s time frame. And we think what maybe made them more popular, have widespread popularity, was actually from the Brothers Grimm fairy tales. Hansel and Gretel, if you remember that story, where the evil witch, she's luring the kids to her with a gingerbread house. So that's the theory of what really got them started. So I've rolled out my dough. Mine is maybe not quite, a little less than half an inch thick. You can make it thick or as thin as you want. And it's still a bit too warm for me to cut at this point in time. But it'll keep cooling a little bit more. So that kind of gives you an overview of how to do this. As far as garnishing goes, so once you have yours cut into shapes, you can use cookie cutters. Just remember, it is a sticky dough. It doesn't have to be cut into squares. But you can simply garnish, if you want, with some whole cloves. That's what the recipe suggested. Now, the original recipe also asked that we garnish with box leaves. Those are poisonous, so we're not doing that. But you might be able to find something else colorful. And another way that they added color that I did not do was actually sandalwood powder. It gave a beautiful red color. Sandalwood's a little hard to find. You can add food coloring if you want to make it more festive looking as well. But keep in mind, this is before they had decorative icings that they could use to start decorating with as well. So it's slowly starting to cool off here. And it's not quite in a good shape. You can cut it in a variety of shapes, but it is, like I said, a spicy bite, so you don't want to eat more than maybe 1 or 2 bites at a time. You might get too much spice. But then again, that's up to you, the cook. You might want to make it spicier than others. When I've made it for coworkers and friends and family, I got varied reactions. Some people really loved it and the amount of spice, and some people wanted more, or some people wanted less spice. So I would encourage you to make this more than once, and feel free to play with the recipe. And one thing I didn't mention in the beginning about the honey, if you have a favorite kind of honey preference, please think about getting that, because the honey flavor does come through fairly strong. And if it's something that you're not a huge fan of, then that might become a little less appealing to your taste buds then. But if you want to get a good honey and you have a preference, that certainly plays into the taste of the recipe as well. So I think this is almost cool enough, but I wanted to be able to show you before we're done today, because we are pretty much done, a finished product. So I have a plate here, and I did a variety of different decorations. I have my snowflakes here. Some came through better than others. I have my squares that I have cut out with a little whole clove here that you can see as well. I have some where I just rolled them into simple balls. That's something that kids can easily do. And as you can see here, I also have my little holly leaves and berries. Some came through very well if I pressed them in well, and some the pattern didn't show through. So keep in mind, if you are selecting a modern mold, that one, you think about what mold you're selecting and how it's going to come out. You can also just leave it plain. A lot of my family just enjoyed eating it plain. Well, that's about all I have for you today, because that is a quick and easy recipe. It comes together very quickly about how to make this gingerbread. I hope you've enjoyed listening to a little bit of the story and the theory about how gingerbread came together. We do have a slide to share with you about the from the original image. The original recipe is housed at the British Library, and here we go. And so that's in the middle. It's in Middle English, since it was written in the 1400s. And so you can see here, it's a little hard to read. So up at the top, we've put the Middle English transcription of the document, of the handwriting. And then down below, we have the modern English version in there. Now, one thing I didn't mention was saffron. Saffron is optional that you can use. It's still a very expensive spice today, as it was then. And so you may not decide to add it. Obviously, I didn't add it in mine either. But pretty much we have followed the directions where we took our honey and we boiled it, and we've added our spices and our breadcrumbs so that it became a dough. And then we rolled it out, and we have not sliced ours yet, but I showed you our finished product. And then you can decorate it. And you can even see there where it asks you to decorate it with that red sandalwood food coloring. So this was a really neat and easy way. Again, when you go to bite into it, it's not going to be your modern gingerbread, but give it a try. I think you'll find it quite tasty. Most of my coworkers and friends and family certainly enjoyed trying something new, and most had never eaten something from this far back in time. I mean, the 1400s is quite far back and in the very early stages of a recipe. So I hope you've enjoyed this episode of the Vintage Kitchen, and I hope you will join me next time, where we take another recipe from the past and bring it forward for the modern cook in the modern kitchen to enjoy. Thanks again for joining me. Bye.